Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first of 3 sessions focused on knowledge exchange with disaster resilience experts from the international Caribbean. My name is Dr. Donya Frank-Gilchrist, and I'm a research oceanographer with the U.S. Geological Survey, St. Petersburg Coastal and Marine Science Center. I am originally from Jamaica, and so it is my distinct honor and privilege to moderate this session on approaches to resilience from the international Caribbean, supported by the USGS Risk Community of Practice and the U.S. Agency for International Development Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. The U.S. Geological Survey is committed to scientific collaboration, capacity building, global learning, and partnership. We recognize that many of the natural hazards impacting the Southeast U.S. and Caribbean are driven by regional scale processes that are coupled to those of neighboring countries. Therefore, they would be better investigated through collaboration with international partners across the region. We might all recall the devastating impacts of Hurricane Maria in Dominica and Puerto Rico in 2017, as well as other islands. In the Southeast U.S. and Caribbean, we share similar vulnerabilities to natural hazards, and so it is quite fitting that the SCDRP has increased their geographic scope to the international Caribbean, because collaborating with our international counterparts is the only way to improve disaster preparedness and resilience across the region. The USGS develops and applies natural hazard science to improve safety and quality of life, reduce the impacts of natural hazards, advance real-time situational awareness, inform strategies for preparedness and resilience, and to support partners across the nation and around the world. Our scientists investigate a wide range of natural hazards and resources, including coastal and marine, earthquakes, fresh water, and ecosystems, among others. In addition, our disaster assistance teams respond to earthquakes, landslides, and volcanoes around the world, jointly supported by the U.S. Agency for International Development. Our scientists are working together with local experts, decision makers, and community leaders to co-develop natural hazards resources so that they may be more accessible to stakeholders. Last year, we conducted several workshops with stakeholders from a range of sectors in Puerto Rico to discuss the accessibility of USGS resources. Based on recommendations through that effort, we developed a series of bilingual web pages on USGS natural hazards resources for Puerto Rico to make them more accessible. Through the support of the USAID, we have expanded our stakeholder engagement efforts to connect with local natural hazards experts in the international Caribbean. We aim to identify their primary hazards of concern, learn about various mitigation efforts, share relevant USGS resources, determine areas of overlapping interest, and discuss the potential for collaborations. So far, we have identified USGS natural hazards projects in 12 Caribbean countries. We are now in the process of categorizing those resources and building a database that will make the information more accessible to our partners. I would like to encourage you to stop by our sponsorship table to connect with us and learn more. Before we hear from our esteemed panelists this afternoon, I would like to invite representatives from the U.S. Department of State, who are co-sponsors for this session, to share a few remarks. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I'm not going to take up too much of your time because I know we all want to hear from this amazing panel of experts. My name is Bridget Moore. I'm with the Office of Global Change, a relatively recent addition to the Office of Global Change in the U.S. Department of State. I do want to tell you a little bit about the overarching way the federal government is approaching adaptation. So President Biden has put the climate crisis back at the center of the U.S. foreign policy. And in recognizing the importance of adaptation and that adaptation can save both lives and livelihoods, he launched the Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience, known as PREPARE, to help more than 500 million people adapt to and manage the impacts of climate change by 2030. So PREPARE is the cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy response to address the increasingly devastating impacts of the global climate crisis, improve the ability of vulnerable communities around the world to confront them, and as a result, bolster regional stability and national security. The PREPARE Action Plan was released last September, and it has 3 key areas. The first and foremost, is the plan recognizes that knowledge is power. The United States will support efforts to deepen global understanding of climate risks, vulnerabilities, and adaptation solutions while supporting expanded development, innovation, and delivery of climate information services, decision support tools, and early warning systems. Second, we will work with our partners to mainstream climate adaptation practices into national and local programs, policies, and budgets, with a focus on supporting locally led and inclusive adaptation. Third, we will help unlock finance to support national, subnational, and local climate adaptation action. This session and this conference in general is a really great example of what we're trying to do under PREPARE's first pillar, about how knowledge is power. Our office is so pleased to have so many participants here from various Caribbean islands to enhance the knowledge exchange of this year's conference. We know that each of these partners is important to realizing advances in climate adaptation strategies, disaster recovery best practices, risk reduction approaches, and climate resilient efforts. So one last thing before I turn it back over to the panel. I think we have a couple of students here, and I would like to invite any students who are here tomorrow morning, if you're interested in learning more about U.S. State Department's climate change work, to meet with my colleague and I. From 9 to 9:30, we'll be in the lobby. And so if you'd like to learn about opportunities in our work, meet us there then. So that's all I'll take your time from this amazing panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bridget. This year, the SCDRP has placed a special emphasis on exchange with esteemed international Caribbean partners so that we can all learn from their perspectives and experiences. Through these sessions, expertise and experience will be shared in order to build a broader understanding of climate adaptation strategies, disaster recovery best practices, risk reduction approaches, and climate resilience efforts. In the interest of time, I highly encourage you to read the detailed bios of our distinguished panelists in the program handbook. And I would now like to invite to the podium our first panelist, Mrs. Gayle Moncur, Deputy Director of the National Emergency Management Agency of the Bahamas.
Good afternoon. Put it up. Okay. The Bahamas is one of the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean region most vulnerable to natural hazards, especially those related to climate. According to the International Disaster Database, the Bahamas has experienced 14 major disasters, mainly hurricanes in the last 20 years. Direct damages to public infrastructure and housing amounting to over $6.7 billion US. When you look at the background and the history of NEMA, or within the Bahamas, we've always had a hurricane death since the early 1970s. The need to have a permanent structure to better prepare and to manage storms became very apparent following the impact of Hurricane Andrew and Floyd in 92 and 99. Approach to disasters broadened to a multi-hazard approach. Thus, the National Emergency Management Agency was named in 2004 and established in law as a department of government with the passage of the Disaster Preparedness and Response Act in February 2006. The natural hazards and resilience priorities. Disasters, namely those caused by climate-related hazards, have become more frequent in years. These include Hurricane Joaquin in 2015, which caused $104.8 million US. Hurricane Matthew, 2016, which caused $438.6 million US, and Irma in 2017, which is $200 million US. Most recently, Hurricane Dorian in 2019 was a Cat 5 hurricane, the most powerful hurricane on record to make landfall. This hurricane caused 67 deaths, approximately 282 persons missing, and more than 2,000 persons who had to be evacuated. With that, we have $2.5 billion in direct damages to infrastructure and housing, $900 million in direct losses and emergency response costs, which caused Marsh Harbor, Abaco, and East End, Grand Bahama, which were the 2 islands that were devastated and impacted, were nearly destroyed. Hurricanes of this magnitude were calculated to occur once every 50 to 100 years, as was talked about in the past panel, but now we are estimated to occur every 25 years. The economic damage caused by climate-related hazards in the Bahamas as a percentage of GDP is higher than in other countries in the Caribbean region. Sorry. When we look at our challenges and major opportunities here, the Disaster Risk Reduction Act of 2022, we see that, as we said before, the Bahamas experienced 14 major disasters, mainly hurricanes, in the last 20 years. And compared with the other disaster-rich risk management components, the Bahamas has a rather robust governance framework for disaster preparedness, at least in matters related to coordination and articulation of policy. Thus, the Disaster Preparedness and Response Act of 2008 establishes, among others, an interinstitutional committee that provides advice to the National Emergency Management Agency, NEMA. The formulation of the National Disaster Preparedness and Response Plan and of official protocols for emergencies, and the testing of protocols through drills and simulation. However, no legal mandate is currently established for the formulation of emergency plans by public bodies, the creation of operation of early warning systems, and the consideration of the special needs of certain groups with the population affected by disasters and emergency response provided by government, among others. The Bahamas DRM governance was mainly legislated by the Disaster Preparedness Response Act of 2008 and the Disaster Reconstruction Authority of 2019. Both acts combined still left the country with governance gaps that hindered the effects to build a more resilient Bahamian society to natural disasters and climate change. The DRM Act of 2022 hopes to narrow these gaps as we move forward as a country. The government's manifesto, our blueprint for change, outlined in point 3 as reconstruction and resilience, mandates strengthening and the governance framework for disaster risk management. Strengthening of the general framework of governance for DRM, the main policy commitments in this component include approval of the legislation to provide for a more effective and comprehensive DRM policy that, in addition to preserving the good practices in the existing legal framework, features the following quality attributes, among others: the establishment of the responsibility framework on DRM for all government levels and government processes, the establishment of a comprehensive and set of instruments for implementation of the DRM policy. The articulation of the DRM policy with other sustainable development-related policies, such as climate change, adaptation, water resources and management, and land use planning, among others. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Mr. Rasheed Pinder, who's the Program Officer for Preparedness and Response at the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency.
Good afternoon. So this afternoon, I'm going to take you guys through a brief overview of the CDEMA mechanism and how we operate within our participating states. I'm going to take you through a preview of the hazards we deal with within the participating states, the measures we utilize to build resilience, and then a little bit on the challenges and the opportunities. So CDEMA, who we are. CDEMA is the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, which is an intergovernmental agency by the Caribbean community for the Caribbean community. Originally established in 1991 as CDERA, the agency first focused on the response element of the disaster management cycle, transitioning in 2009 to focus on comprehensive disaster management, realizing the challenges, the gaps, and the issues. Now, in 2021, there was a review of the CDEMA mechanisms, and this review came from the impacts from prior years, 2021 and before. This preview was to identify gaps, challenges, and areas where there may be of future concerns. From this, the new CDEMA 2022 to 2027 strategic plan emerged. This plan has a vision for the agency to be the leading comprehensive disaster management expert, supporting sustainable development and fostering a culture of safety and resilience in the Caribbean community. A mission to lead and empower participating states to address all aspects of the comprehensive disaster management in an increasingly challenging environment. A number of core values and a number of strategic objectives, including to accelerate the development of CDM capacities within the participating states, building the next level regional response mechanism, accelerating the recovery program, and positioning CDEMA to deliver now and in the future. Now, I'm going to give you an overview of the regional multi-hazard context we face. Now, for this, I want you to keep your eyes on the screen and travel to the Caribbean with me today. Now, this is a representation of what we experienced within 2021. April 2021, we had the explosive volcanic eruption within St. Vincent and the Grenadines. While dealing with this and responding to this event, within just May-June 2021, we had significant flooding due to prolonged rainfall within Guyana. Shortly after that, we had the 7.2 magnitude earthquake within Haiti in August 2021. Right after that, in September 2021, there was the impacts of Hurricane Elsa across Barbados, noting that Barbados was heavily impacted by the volcanic eruption as well, as a lot of the ash flowed eastward, and this caused a tremendous impacts to Barbados, all while still dealing with drought. So imagine all of these going on and then still responding to the drought impacts. And then, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. So, of course, we focus on the hydrometeorological hazards, but the 2021 season was testimony that there are a plethora of hazards which are impacted by the climate context and varying other variables. And then these hazards, they have a number of cascading effects we've been observing within the region. So we're observing a case now where within any given year, we are being impacted by multiple hazards, and then sometimes one island being impacted by multiple hazards in itself. I'll give you an example again of Haiti across 2021. Not only did they have the 7.2 magnitude earthquake in August, but shortly after they were hit by a tropical depression, I believe it was Fred, and then right after that, heavy rainfall, and then that was in the midst of their political situation. So a number of hazards happening within the region. But what are we doing as an agency? In terms of the CDEMA Resilient Framework, we're looking at social protection for the marginal and the most vulnerable, enhancing the economic opportunities, safeguarding infrastructure, environmental protection, operational readiness, and recovery, governed by a number of cross-cutting themes. I mean, you can see them here on the screen, but including capacity building, gender inclusivity, effective governance, etc. Now, as it speaks to the challenges and opportunities, because of course, across this time, there were a number of challenges across the response and building the readiness of the participating states. These spanned across limited human resources, the lack of sustainability of the projects, whether that was preparedness or recovery projects, financing. But of course, there were a number of opportunities as well. Stronger partnerships and coordinations were developed. For the COVID-19 pandemic, we established the COVID-19 Logistics Hub. There was greater stakeholder engagements, definitely greater engagements with the UN agencies and the UN systems, particularly WFP, UNDP, and of course there were a number of avenues for growth. In the interest of time, I kept it short, but of course, should you have any questions, queries, follow-up, you can find me afterward. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that perspective. Our next panelist is Mr. Jeremy Collymore. He's a disaster risk management and resilience specialist, honorary research fellow at the Institute for Sustainable Development at the University of the West Indies. Mr. Collymore is also the former executive director for the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency. Thank you.
Good afternoon, all. Thank you, Moderator. The University of the West Indies, I'm very pleased to share with you an overview of this institution. This year, we are proud to celebrate 75 years of service and leadership in higher education institution support for development in the region. You want to join us in celebrating the University of the West Indies? Thank you very much. We have a student population of approximately 50,000 persons, 50,000 students across 5 campuses. We are globally active with spaces in at least 5 regions, and we are a very activist university and CIS engaged. We operate in an environment in which hazards and development interface is a reality, and the setback and the economic consequences, as implied by Rasheed, are quite evident. Hurricanes Irma and Maria, followed by Hurricane Donya in the Bahamas in 2019, articulated a concern about the existential threat to our small island developing states. And that is the context that has given rise to the Universities of the West Indies Resilience Initiative. We are seeking to articulate a platform of support to assist those countries in elaborating the political proposition or value proposition of a resilient Caribbean state. And therefore, we recognize it's very important to understand those risks and to communicate them to different audiences based on the need for decision and actions. We also recognize that we are not the only persons operating in that space, and therefore, we are collaborating with universities across the world within the framework of the International Association of Universities and the Association of the Commonwealth Universities. We are the founder of the Commonwealth Climate Resilience Network. So partnering as an integral part of our process. We have, and this is a very short list, I would say, approximately 30 specialized institutes, centers, and initiatives built around the issue of resilience spread across our university community. This is ways in which we are building partnerships with the countries and with other higher education institutions. And if you look at the subject matters, you will realize that continuously we have engaged in initiatives to address the emerging changes and issues in our development space. So, how do we prioritize action in a very constrained resource environment and a multi-action space? So, we think, first of all, that higher education, knowledge, and research should help us to really transform behavior and action through the application of that knowledge to practice. Secondly, we recognize that these are not piecemeal approaches, So the blue economy and the green economy, they take place in one space. So how do we construct that information in a systemic way that can be holistically applied to decision making? We are using our tools, our data analytics, etc., to inform that process. And of course, humans' actions and human decisions are very important to that process. And that whole question of understanding the vulnerabilities and where they are puts people back at the center of that. We talked this morning about community engagement, and we are willing to really partner with entities in localizing the initiative through collaboratives between universities, development partners, and financiers, right in the spaces where these risks are experienced, the devastation and losses are felt. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Collymore. And our fourth panelist this afternoon is Dr. Colin Young, Executive Director for the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center based in Belize. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Speaking right after lunch is never a good place to be, you know. I feel like I should be jumping up to get you woken up. First, I want to thank the SCDRP for the invitation to be with you today. I really appreciate being here. The 5 Cs, very easy to remember, but long-winded to say, Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, was set up in 2002 by an intergovernmental agreement among 15 CARICOM member states to coordinate the region's response to climate change. And we've been doing that since 2004. The headquarters of the center is in Belize. And we recently went through a strategic planning process. You can see our mission on the screen. What we do really is to assist the member countries to provide data for evidence-based decision making, and then to help them access financial resources to undertake both mitigation and adaptation interventions within the Caribbean. We have 3 core services that we provide to our member states. The first one is data and very relevant evidence-based data that allows us to pursue development resilient to climate change. Over the last 15 years, we would have installed over 200 automatic weather stations across the Caribbean that provides real-time information to the Met offices, and it backs up at our clearinghouse at the center, which hosts the largest repository of Caribbean-specific climate information anywhere, and then also goes on to other institutes like the Caribbean Institute of Hydrology and Meteorology, who does the climate services work like projections for droughts and precipitation. And it's also utilized, I see Dr. Taylor here, as well from the climate modeling group in their modeling, downscaling information of global climate models to regional climate models. We also help the countries, as I said, mobilize resources. To date, we've accessed and invested over $300 million across 15 CARICOM member states to build resilience. And we play a very important role in the international climate change negotiations. We write all of the technical briefs for the heads of states and CARICOM climate change ministers. We bring negotiators together. We train negotiators to negotiate in the climate change conventions. And we help to shape what those priorities are. We are led by what we call a regional framework for achieving development resilient to climate change. You can see these priorities on the screen. These are not the 5 Cs. These are the ones that are articulated by the 15 CARICOM member states. And so we would help them to access resources to implement these priorities that you see. We pursue projects primarily to build resilience. We've moved away from single sector projects, but we pursue projects that build resilience across multiple sectors like water, food, and energy. And for us in the Caribbean, energy is a key part of our adaptation resilience, not so much mitigation, because, you know, as a region, we are responsible for less than 1% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. But for example, in Barbados, we have $100 million in projects transforming the resilience of the water sector by using renewable energy to provide power when the power source goes down because of hurricanes and tropical storms. And so that gets water to critical infrastructure like hospitals and citizens using renewable energy. The actual mitigating option of it is extremely negligible. It's there for actual adaptation. And we also work with countries to also do things like drainage, to deal with floods. As you know, the amount of rainfall, our infrastructure is not built to accommodate the amount of water that falls in this short amount of time. Challenges, I will go, one of it is data. There are still quite a bit of data gaps that we need, and we're working to build that out to provide that information for decision making. And then, of course, the big issue, the biggest challenge is the issue of the cost of the financing and the scale of the capital costs. And I just quickly want to spend my last minute by saying the issue here is really significant. Why? Because the first issue is the debt to GDP ratio. Most Caribbean countries is significantly indebted, up 90% on average debt to GDP. And a bulk of that debt is because of climate disasters. In the case of Dominica, one hurricane, couple of hours, 220% of its GDP wiped out. 2 years before, Tropical Storm Erica wiped out 90%. Had Hurricane Maria hit the U.S. in terms of the impact on Dominica's GDP relative to the damages in the U.S., it would have been equivalent to about 44 trillion US dollars. That's the scale. Now, because you were a middle-income country, we don't qualify for concessional financing. And so on average, you're borrowing between 11 and 20%, right? And every year, you're losing between 7 to 10% just on a normal, non-major hurricane year. So you never get out of the hole. So this idea of building back better sounds really good, but in terms of how you afford it with the tax base that you have, it's virtually impossible. And this is where the loss and damage debate in the climate change issue and funding and concessional financing. And we're hoping by, for example, using debt instruments and disaster-linked clauses in loans so that when there is a disaster, countries should not be forced to pay back a loan or to rebuild your community. You should be able to get some liquidity to invest into rebuilding back better, and you extend the length of the loan so that you can then, nobody loses, right? You get back the money. So we are one of the most vulnerable areas in the world. We need to rebuild and build our resilience, but access to financing is absolutely a challenge, and we need access to concessional loans. We need to get rid of the GDP per capita criteria that qualifies you for concessional financing and move to a vulnerability index. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Young. All right. We will start our panel discussion with a question to each panelist. Would each of you please share what are the top multi-hazard or climate change concerns across the Greater Caribbean region? We'll start with Mrs. Gayle Moncur.
For us, that would be, of course, hurricanes. And we would also have surge, sea surge, when it comes down to that, yes.
I share the sentiments of Gayle. Definitely within the region, I would say it is that of hurricanes. I mean, when I think about Hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017, you know, 2 Category 5 hurricanes within one season, just 2 weeks apart, and the destruction that they caused. You know, when I think about 2019 and Hurricane Dorian
Yes.
on the Bahamas and the decimation that caused. When I think about the 2020 hurricane season, you know, producing about 30 named storms or so. Extending the Greek naming convention, you know, being one of the most active seasons on record, having like 13 hurricanes, 6 of them being major hurricanes, Eta and Iota in there, which caused great impact across the Americas and Belize, significant flooding. When we think about Barbados and Hurricane Elsa in 2021, that was the first hurricane impact since 1955. So when I think about myself, you know, I wasn't around in 1955, so that was the first major impact that I had experienced. And then my community, you know, was out of telecommunications, was out of water, electricity for like about 10, 12 days, you know. So there were a number of associated impacts there, a number of psychosocial impacts. I remember speaking to some colleagues, and they're like, you know, you haven't experienced that, and it's like, you know, the water's off, you didn't prepare adequately enough, because you thought, okay, category 1, and you're hearing category 1's passing here or there, but then definitely just that category 1, how that impacted us. So I would say the most concern is that of the more intense and frequent hurricanes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would I would want to suggest that at the core of all of that is a better understanding of the hazards and the society and economy interface. My friend Colin spoke about the whole question of the disaster risk financing, which really is a reflection of the need for a better understanding of the hazards, the impact on society, and the process of monetization. And that will give us a better space to engage in a very concrete way in the loss and damage conversations. And really then allow us to make some very concerted conversations about prioritization. I think we have started a lot of this, but it's very disconnected and piecemeal, really driven by individual research, whether as an entity or as an institutional. So I would say to many of you who are engaged here, who want to operate in that space, this is an opportunity to frame a partnership with the University of the West Indies, or other things. We have a coordinated mechanism. And the university has just established the Global Institute for Climate Smart and Resilient Development to provide that benchmark for engagement of partners of all kinds. Thank you.
Yes, I think that's definitely one of the values of a meeting such as this one. So, thank you. Dr. Young?
I won't repeat what was said in terms of the hurricane, so I'll focus on the slow onset events in terms of drought and sea level rise that is causing massive coastal erosion across the region, threatening essential coastal infrastructure. You know, parts of the Caribbean have a disproportionately high increase in sea level. Most of the Caribbean is coastal. You know, I heard people talking about when there's a hurricane coming to Florida or elsewhere, you can move onto either side of the panhandle or out of the panhandle completely. Well, when a Hurricane Maria or Irma is staring down Dominica or the Bahamas, where are you going to go? There's only so much you can drive before you have to have a submarine vehicle to get out, right? But it's the issue of the scale. So that is key. And the last point I want to make is that the frequency and intensity of the disasters are overwhelming the entirety of our infrastructure because they're happening so quickly and they're happening so intensely that our drains they're not deep enough and wide enough to move the water. Our electricity grids are not able to tolerate the extra heat and all of this stuff. So when you have all of those hazards happening roughly in parallel or sequentially, that is the challenge. So we know about hurricanes, but the fact that they're happening all at the same time or relatively close to each other, it's overwhelming our ability to respond.
Right, there's no time to recover. I was really impressed by Mr. Pinder's demonstration of all the different hazards that impacted the Caribbean in that 1 year. So quite a mammoth task. Our next question is to Mrs. Moncur. We'll shift to a slightly more positive note. Would you please share a success story from the Bahamas regarding hazard vulnerability, adaptation, or mitigation?
When we look at the success stories, basically you have to think of the Bahamas as being vulnerable, the whole of the Bahamas, because we are an island nation. And when you look at the amount of hurricanes that would have actually hit us during the years, we look at the success stories in terms of what we do. So we have invested in doing the Coastal Zone Management Project, where we've tried to improve the coastal areas. We also look at the reconstruction of the mangroves because we know with the sea surge and storm surges and all of those things that are happening, we have to replant and rebuild and not encourage so much building on the coastal side of that. With all of that in progress, we've had partnerships with many other organizations, one that being the Pacific Disaster Center, PDC, where we would have done a baseline assessment for all of the islands so that you would be able to look at their vulnerable areas. And each island per se, or those persons living on that island, are able to look at what are my vulnerable areas and how could I now improve these areas and really buy into what we can do for ourselves on each of these islands individually, because all of the islands have different characteristics, even though when you look at the Bahamas, people said, oh, it's the Bahamas and all of the islands, but everything runs a little differently. And so out of that, we are also doing a training known as the disaster aware training so that we can use this and implement and get more information with information sharing. Because information sharing is very critical, and it's one of these things that people tend to hold back on when you look at information and that type of data that you want to give out. Also, we have looked at the building codes, strengthening the building codes. We do have strong building codes, but however, you still have people who slip through the cracks where they don't stick with the building codes. Because when you look at Hurricane Dorian, when it in Grand Bahama and Abaco, it was not so much the strength of the building, but more in terms of when you have your surges with the water coming through and being able to knock down those buildings and being able to withstand the force of water when you consider that. Also, we look at the zoning and planning, but where can we go? We are a coastal country, so how much more inland can you really go? So we're still going back to, like they say, back into the 1940s and 50s when you built more on stilts so that you could have the water going through, improving your restoration of the mangroves, again, like I talked about, and then also living more inland rather than directly on the coast, because we tend to have persons who want to have second homeowners. They want to really build in the water, not understanding that we are a hurricane zone, and that is very difficult. But when you think about those type of success stories, people are now understanding and buying into what it is that I have to do to make building back better, more sensible.
Thank you so much for sharing that perspective. I think one thing that's really impressive with the Caribbean is how all the organizations work together when a particular country faces a natural disaster. And so, Mr. Pinder, would you please share what mechanisms CDEMA has in place to build the resilience of the Caribbean region against the climate crisis?
All right, so I would have mentioned earlier that in 2009, the agency would have transitioned to focus on comprehensive disaster management. This approach is governed right now by the Strategic Comprehensive Disaster Management Strategy, which ran from 2014 and it's going to 2024. Basically, it was an assessment of the participating states, a number of stakeholders, and the priorities that emerged, etc. But it's basically an everyday approach to building resilience. It's an approach where it goes from the regional to the national to the community levels, across the areas of the disaster management cycle, from preparedness, mitigation, etc., to build our participating states. As it relates to our preparedness mechanisms to date, what we've been doing is ensuring that the participating states, we've been ensuring that they update their national disaster management plans and their hazard-specific plans to incorporate elements of the climate crisis. So, for example, noting that you may get that 1-in-1-year flooding, noting that you might get those more intense and frequent hurricanes, noting that the multi-hazard context, especially during 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic, integrating that in there as well. On the preparedness lens, again, having a number of exercises, both tabletop and functional, to prepare us to become more ready and more resilient overall if indeed these impacts that are exacerbated by climate change do occur. As it relates to our response mechanisms to build resilience, there's that of the regional response mechanism, which has been accelerating or transforming over the years again to incorporate climate change and those climatic effects and ensuring that we have our deployment teams on hand who can be activated for any emerging hazards. There's a huge recovery program as well. And then as it relates to the community level, I'll just say one thing on the community level. There's a huge Safe Schools program right now that's focused on building, one, the infrastructure of the schools within the participating states, but then two, and I think most importantly, the education and the awareness of the youth and those who will be the future leaders within the space, sort of building the resiliency of the minds and of the people to then build the resiliency of the system.
Absolutely. That is the perfect segue to my next question. I think partnership across sectors has been a recurring theme today. And so, Mr. Collymore, what do you see as the role of higher education institutions in disaster recovery and resilience?
Well, first, let me set the context of HEIs in small and developing states. In many cases, this or these are the largest reservoir of technical expertise in a single space. So if I say that, I think one of the first things that the institutions themselves must be doing to facilitate whatever role they have is to really embrace the idea of a resilient institution, where the issue of risk planning is really integrated into the management, the teaching, and the operational services. This is really like teach by doing. So I will set that as a very important context. And because we believe so strongly in that, we have collaborated with the Association of Commonwealth Universities to really draft a model framework for continuity to continuity operations within higher education institutions. And we are using that model to also work through with sectors like in tourism. So we are doing it for ourselves, and we are trying to promote that. Secondly, I think that not what we do, but what we need to do better. And given the nature of the hazards and the change in environment, it means we have to redesign our knowledge products and the capacity development. I'd be so bold as to say, we may even have to re-articulate our certification programs, you know, and how people earn their degrees through practice in spaces and that kind of thing, and how our professors are assessed to allow them for their rigorous involvement in this research to practice application be considered for promotion. Mm-hmm. Right? In the meantime, we are doing real things like helping the Bahamas articulate its recovery policy and strategy. It's the first country in the Caribbean to do that, led by the University of West Indies team. We are working with the government of Dominica to really kind of give what we call hazard-related matrix, meet the matrix that they have established for their national development resilience strategy. And so they have taken the leap, but they do not know what they have. That's the first experience they're going. So we are working with them to articulate that. And these are the kinds of things that we are doing, and we can do more of, but we have to rethink what the HEI as a key resource in small MDCs should be doing for itself.
Right. Thank you. Absolutely agree. And I'd just like to add, I think a lot of times the academic researchers are on the forefront of investigating these hazards from a scientific perspective, and so they have the knowledge. So definitely need more collaboration to share that information to the decision makers. And Dr. Young, would you please discuss the role of timely and relevant data in the effective preparation and response to climate-related hazards in the region, and how the 5 Cs is working to fill existing gaps, if any?
Thank you very much. Three areas I think timely and relevant data is important. One is obviously we needed to design better early warning systems to be able to advise our citizens in real time about what they should do or shouldn't do with disasters that are approaching. The 5 Cs in terms of that is working, as I said, with the automatic weather stations. We have the only Caribbean-owned LiDAR capability with a grant from USAID, so we can do topo and coastal bathymetric work that can go into the storm surge modeling and also inform coastal planning and development. We need to get these messages out to farmers about droughts that are coming. We need to get information out to citizens to move out of flood-prone areas via text or other means that are quite available. So that's one. Second is obviously to inform how we design our roads or bridges and critical infrastructure. We went to a wastewater treatment plant in Virginia Keys, and you could see how they're incorporating the knowledge about storm surge and based both on historical data and future data projections. So that's key. And then 3, in terms of de-risking investment from the private sector. We need to crowd in private investment to build climate resilience in the region. To do that has been very difficult. One, because the private sector, they don't know the risk, and because they don't know all the risks, the expected rate of returns or the interest are extremely expensive. And so if we have data that allows them to manage the risks, then lending rates and ROIs would decrease. And then lastly, and this is self-serving for the 5 Cs, is that one of the biggest barriers to accessing international climate finance from a grants point of view, from places like the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund, and even now from some of the MDBs, is this idea of demonstrating what is called the climate rationale. There's an artificial distinction between development finance and climate finance, and the climate funds don't want to fund development because they think that's the responsibility of the state. For small island developing states, they're almost one and the same. But whatever it is that you're applying for money for, you have to be able to have the data to demonstrate that the problem you're trying to fix is in fact caused by climate change, and that the interventions you're going to propose is going to outlast some future state in terms of the projections. Very few Caribbean island states have data going back 30 years in the kind of high intensity that a lot of the donors want. So as we build the infrastructure of getting this data, not only does it have the benefit of improving early warning systems, improving your ability to build smartly and build back better, but it also allows entities like the 5 Cs, governments, and other entities to access monies to build back better in CARICOM member states.
Very interesting, thank you. I think definitely a deeper knowledge of the hazard mitigation process and developmental challenges within the Caribbean will hopefully assist with some of those. I think we have time for one question from the audience before we wrap up. Okay, I see one hand over here. Is there a mic? Thank you.
There was a lot of discussion about warming temperatures with respect to the intensity and frequency of storms, and Mr. Pinder and Dr. Young, I'm sorry, mentioned drought, but I'm wondering if extreme heat is something that's on your radar as a natural hazard, just both for its human health impacts, but also for the stress that it puts on infrastructure, as Dr. Young also mentioned, with energy demand and everything else. So just wanted to.
Thank you. Would anyone like to speak to that?
I mean, from what we're seeing is we have some projects in the Bahamas and Trinidad and I believe St. Lucia that is looking at the relationship between climate change and health. And one of the issues is looking at the impact it's having on agricultural workers, construction workers, because of heat exhaustion. Our houses in the Caribbean are generally built for natural ventilation, but now the temperatures are increasing, and when you look at the projections, and Dr. Taylor is here, will tell you that the projections are going to get even worse. And already what we're finding is that the private sector, the construction industry, they're already modifying their behavior in terms of having workers work very early in the morning, have a much greater break in the hottest part of the day and working into the night. But we are getting a larger number of hotter days and hotter nights, and those numbers are going to increase. So I think you're going to see having to have OSHA standards that will have to be developed, and the design of our buildings, both public and individual housing, will have to now take into account these things. So it's not a front and center issue, but it's already happening, and we are seeing the impacts of it.
Thank you. And to wrap up our panel discussion, I will ask one final question to all the panelists. What are the greatest areas of need to enhance regional climate resilience that you think collaborating with U.S. entities could help to accomplish?
Obviously, funding, and more funding, training and funding, and partnership, lots of partnership and funding, partnership, training.
And funding.
Yeah, so funding. But to add, I would definitely say the investment in human resources as well. So whether that's a case where it may be a partnership where experts from a U.S. entity comes in and trains with the local level or builds up that capacity, so then you can have a trainer, and then we can build a greater body of human resources within the region to support the region, and then that can be sort of a positive cascading effect. So that's what I would say.
Thank you.
Yes, there's significant initiatives by the U.S. government in the Caribbean, and there may be a need for us to have a conversation about rationalization to get the biggest impact. Even among those who are engaged in those spaces, they are overlapping, not necessarily the same. And that would allow, of course, for some opportunities also for the region for capacity building and even experience sharing. Because I think we learned a lot from small states. That when you localize the experiences that I heard described this morning by those counties, there may be some actual cross-sharing. Mm-hmm. And I would certainly want to encourage that as an outcome of this exercise, we start to look at those presentations this morning and what you've heard this afternoon to really identify one or two concrete things that can build an initial experience, engaging experience within the context of this framework. And then challenge the Assistant Secretary General to complement that effort.
I would just say ditto. But also the issue of data. I think the 5Cs has worked. We had a MOU with NOAA, and we can work with other technical agencies in terms of closing the information data gaps that exist. It just happens to turn out that a lot of the tropical systems end up here anyways, and having that data sort of underground, very fine scale, high intensity data can really assist both NOAA and in our National Hurricane Center in terms of nowcasting with these storms. So that's not completely altruistic, but also in a sense the sharing. There's a lot of real good solutions that are happening in the region, both nature-based solutions, both in terms of that came out of just sheer necessity in terms of dealing with a barrage of natural disasters that has hit the region, and there's this ability to share lessons learned between these agencies and the Caribbean. And then lastly, I think this idea of getting this information in a form and a way that is easily accessible to the users of this information. I think one of our faults, and I'm a scientist as well, is we often talk in a language that the average person does not understand. And especially when we start to talk about 2100 and 2200 and impacts over these long time horizons, while important, you know, we lose a lot of people. And I think how we get that to citizen science, that really for people who want specific information, just let's get it to them in a very simple way. And I think we can work to get that done.
Thank you so much for that perspective. I strongly believe that partnerships between the U.S. and the international Caribbean would definitely be mutually beneficial. So thank you so much for sharing your time, experience, and expertise. This is indeed an informative panel discussion, and we're looking forward to further discussions on potential collaborations between the U.S. and international Caribbean so that we can improve resilience across the entire region. Thank you.